Let's move to the human movement part because this is a very important point about our species. We've already mentioned that from the beginning of the evolution of humans, it is in their nature to have moved in search of food, in search of shelter, in search of adventure, in search of a better life. That impulse continues to this day, whether it's something we call colonization, whether we call it immigration, whether we call it refugees fleeing from terrible circumstances, but it's a phenomenon that stays with us across the planet, and it's accelerating. It accelerated when the so-called new worlds were discovered, with people moving into Australia, Canada, the Americas. That kind of movement brought people out of the so-called old world to the new worlds. But even in these places now, we're seeing a phenomenal increase in the populations of those countries, the so-called new world, as a consequence of ongoing immigration. But even in the old world, the so-called European world of Western civilization, there too you see tremendous shifts and equally large growths of populations as a consequence, again, of migrations from country to country or from region to region, or as a consequence of upheavals and refugees looking for a home. But it's not just the Western world where this change is happening. It's happening in Africa, it's happening in the Arab world, it's happening in Russia, it's happening in China. Huge human movements as technology makes it possible for people to know what's available around the world, to see where there might be opportunities for their life to be improved, and the human urge to better themselves is both a push and a pull factor. The pull factors are the possibility of a safe life, perhaps, the possibility of a job, the possibility of better health, and the push factors are economic issues like poverty or isolation or war. Those factors continue to play a role in the human movement that is occurring around the world, and something that we need to take on board as we consider what the factors are that impact on the identity of the people who end up in our classrooms. Of course, if we take the American example, it is an extraordinary example of human movement. Indigenous peoples who came originally from perhaps other parts of the globe, from the north and from the south, colonial peoples who came looking to escape whatever tyranny or mishaps they had in their original homes. They brought with them into the American context slaves, they brought with them indentured labour, and eventually there were large numbers of immigrants who came to the Americas and to the United States in particular, looking to create a decent home. They were African, they were German, they were Italian, they were from Great Britain, from Ireland, from Scotland, from Canada, the Soviet Union, Mexico, Norway, Denmark, France, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Greece, Italy, Poland, Portuguese, on and on. People came in all their diversity to become part of a new nation and a new world where their differences would not be a barrier to a good life. A strange thing happened along the way, however. Again, this impulse to categorize, this impulse to count people in their differences, the emergence of something called, or the idea of white, became a defining feature and grouped some people in ways that allowed them access to resources that weren't exactly the same as those who were regarded as non-white. It is a phenomenon in this country, it was a phenomenon in Australia, a phenomenon in other parts of the world too, that these categories were easily used in order to negotiate resources, the same basic needs for material survival, for emotional survival, and for symbolic survival. The United States, of course, continuing that trend of receiving immigrants and refugees, the speculation is, and the modelling that's been done, suggests that by 2060, this group that congregated itself around the category of white will become the minority category within a nation that is much more diverse in years to come. This has created an issue for many people, positively and negatively, but it has created a particular issue for those who like to categorize and to group. And in particular, the United States Census, that historically counted people for all sorts of complex purposes into white and black, and then the other were American, Native Americans, Asians, Hispanic, and Islander. Very strange combination to have two categories that are around pigment and other categories that are around ethnicity or perhaps nation. For many decades, there have been shifts around those, in fact centuries, shifts around those categories. But today, given the trajectory of the United States, those categories are creating even more serious problems for identity, for understanding who we are, and understanding how we negotiate with each other, and understanding our common humanity. So much so, even for the census, that for the next census, there is a conversation about getting rid of the categories of race altogether and allowing people to define themselves in multiple ways and with other categories, socioeconomic categories, household makeup, language, all those other categories, but knowing that the category of race defined by pigment or defined by ethnicity has not been a very useful way of creating the possibility of an equal society and a humanity that understands the importance of sharing resources, material, emotional, and symbolic. Nonetheless, these categories of race, of colour and ethnicity pertain not just in the United States, but all over the world. But the same kind of diversity that is occurring in the United States is the same whether you go to Syria, for example, or whether you go to Malaysia or Brazil or any other part of the world. Human movement has produced within nation states complex diversity and complex ways in which people need to negotiate in order to meet their needs. The world population, if we have a look at who exists in the world, the majority of people who actually, the human beings who live on the planet, are either Indian or Chinese. They take up almost 2/3 of the planet in populations, but within those categories there are huge number of differences of peoples within the categories that call themselves that. And of course the other nations that, whether it's the United Nations or Indonesia or Brazil or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nigeria or Russia or any of these nations that define themselves with a singular imagination, within their borders are peoples from all over the world. So if we are going to prepare learners to be positive citizens, workers and learners within their own country, they also have to recognise how they need to recognise and negotiate the rest of the world in addition to their own communities.